This video will explore the basic teaching of the church when it comes to war and peace that has evolved over 2,000 years. The church's teaching on war and peace for the first 300 years was basically a pacifist position. And this was really grounded fundamentally in the New Testament's understanding of Jesus as nonviolent, and that number one, that God is the Father of all people and therefore are not to be harmed. And there was among early Christian people an abhorrence to bloodshed. They just felt that that was simply in violation of Jesus's commandment for love of God and love of neighbor. Generally speaking, too, they didn't join the military the first 300 years as a whole, because they also rejected, of course, emperor worship, but that came generally with belonging to the Roman military. The word sacrament comes from the Roman word sacramentum, which was a tattoo that they would put upon your arm, which basically said, in representing the Roman Senate and the Republic of Rome. So this, of course, was unacceptable to Christians that would not worship the emperor, simply was inconsistent with a monotheistic tradition of Christianity. And the moral conduct of the soldiers was not inconsistent with the Christian moral ethical framework about sexuality and drunkenness and so forth. So they simply rejected the sort of moral or lack thereof life of Roman soldiers. And of course, this was an underground church at the time, and the persecutions would flare up. So it really wasn't accepted by society, as a typical religious tradition was actually seen often as an adversary. So Christians as a whole did not have any real desire to join the Roman military at that time. Things began to change, however, after the first 300 years, when we begin to see on the northern borders of the empire, Germanic tribes were beginning to make inroads on the Roman Empire and seemed to threaten Rome itself. And it was at this time that one of the early church fathers, St. Augustine, consulting some of the traditional writings of the pagan writers such as Seneca and others, began to look at this and say, we cannot allow civilization to simply go down the tube. So after 313 AD, when Constantine published the Edict of Milan, the just war doctrine began to take shape. By 313 AD, Christianity was tolerated, and then by 381 AD, Christianity was the official religion of the Roman Empire. So you can see that these two major developments put Christianity and the Roman Empire's fate together, for better or for worse. And of course, people like Augustine writing around this time did not want to see Roman civilization simply collapse without any kind of central authority in the area that could lead to chaos. And so Augustine was trying to find ways that the church could, or members of the church could, participate in defense of the empire. And he began to look at, again, these more traditional forms of pagan concerns about what it means to fight a just war in order to prevent the tribes from overwhelming the Roman Empire. Now, we also get another development later on. First we have the pacifist option, then we see the development of the just war theory, which we'll look at shortly, and then we look at the whole notion of the crusade. Now, this really begins generally at the very end of the 12th century, when Pope Urban II declared a crusade in the Middle East to recapture the Holy Lands for Christianity. They had been in the hands of Muslims for about 400 years. It didn't seem that there was any particular big problem, but Urban decided that he wanted to unify Christianity, and so started conjuring all kinds of stories about atrocities committed against Christians and so forth. Well, with the Crusades, the gloves come off, and anyone who was not a Christian in the Holy Land, of course, was considered an infidel. Of course, Muslims returned the favor to Christians, and we see the onslaught that began with the Crusades. The Crusades did not really follow the just war theory whatsoever. They saw this as some kind of holy war, and so there was no real constraints in how you dealt with the enemy. It is difficult, of course, for wars to not end up like this. For instance, the Civil War in the United States, World War I and World War II, can quickly become crusades because you want to get the general population behind this kind of activity. And so there are a couple of processes that occur at this time. One, of course, is the demonization of the adversary, make them less human, make it so that they've committed such egregious offenses against you that war seems to be the only option, the most honorable option. And of course, you coat it over with that patriotic overlay, which calls upon, of course, some of the finest attributes of self-sacrifice among human beings, but often it's not simply for a just war, or even sometimes for a just cause, but so often it serves other interests such as power politics or the ambitions of rulers. So in this particular case, of course, with the Crusades, they turned into a fairly bloody affair. It was not unusual, especially in the First Crusade, as Crusaders were um, you marching toward the Holy Land, that they would go through Eastern Europe, simply slaughtering Jews in a number of Eastern European cities for no reason other than they were Jews, which was part of the typical anti-Judaism of Christianity throughout its history. And it was, unfortunately, this, of course, was done in God's name, which is a big no-no, as we know. Now, the church has since rejected the crusade. They felt that, no, this was wrong. The only real two options are pacifism and the just war options. Now, both of these presume against the use of violence, against war. But in the case of emergency, where especially with the just war, where there's a real threat of unjust aggression or an unjust aggression has occurred, you're trying to restore injured rights, and that's something we'll look at very shortly. Under the just war theory, of course, humanitarian intervention may be required to prevent genocide. This has certainly become a modern concern with the Holocaust in the Second World War, but even prior to that, the Armenian genocide that was attempted by the Turks during the First World War raised significant issues for modern society and the international relations among states. So there was this real deep concern, especially after World War II, that we must never allow genocide to occur again. And so states are often called upon, especially under the UN Genocide Convention, not to allow this type of slaughtering of certain people within the borders of a particular state to continue. So it may be required that outside states intervene to prevent the slaughter. Now, the principles of the just war we want to go over just so we have an understanding of what this is. First of all, there's basically what are, in war itself, what are some of the principles that guide us? Number one, that discrimination and proportionality have to be observed. You may not harm non-combatants deliberately, and proportionality means only the means necessary to accomplish an objective can be used to restore injured rights. So not all weapons and strategies are permissible. Hence, nuclear weapons and weapons of mass destruction really don't fit into this criteria. Now, before one goes to war, of course, you have to establish, number one, a just cause. This is for the protection against unjust aggression, where it is clear that innocent people are being harmed because of war. Right intention, that is to restore injured rights. We are not going to war for self-aggrandizement, but rather to restore those rights that have been injured by another party of people you feel have been unjustly treated. The other thing, of course, is you have to exhaust all other means before resorting to violence. So negotiation, other types of perhaps bargaining can occur before resorting to violence. And of course, it must be declared by a competent authority. We can't have a general who's gone rogue decide to initiate a war. Certainly in the nuclear age, that could be possible under certain circumstances, depending upon who has delegation authority or release authority for these weapons. Now, just looking over the four principles, we know there are certain issues that can come up and can be a problem. For instance, who's to determine whether or not the cause is really just? Uh, Many people have used this as a reason for launching aggressive war. Certainly, the most grotesque form was in the 20th century when Hitler launched a war, against Poland because of "quote unquote" the offenses that Poland had committed against German citizens in their country, especially in the Danzig corridor area. We see the same thing, of course, with Czechoslovakia, that he had raised the issue that Sudetenland Germans were being mistreated and oppressed, and so it justified annexing the Sudetenland under German authority and eventually the invasion of the entire country of Czechoslovakia. So just cause has to be carefully monitored. We have to see if in fact it does measure up. In fact, the intention is true as well, not just to restore injured rights, but that clearly the intention is that the state that is involved in prosecuting a just war can make good cause that it itself will not benefit. That in fact it is really simply restoring injured rights to injured parties. Exhausting all other means is a tricky one because often wars have a certain timeline before they are launched. Usually an adversary is served notice that there's a timeline, and you wonder sometimes if enough has been done to really explore all other means before resorting to violence. So you can see that the first three principles of why we would go to war as a just war do have problematic areas here. And who exactly constitutes the competent authority? In the United States, of course, it's the President of the United States. But we also know that some periods in history there was delegation authority passed down to submarine commanders, which under certain circumstances they could launch on their own authority if in fact it had been determined that a nuclear war was underway. So you can see that this particular just war criteria does have some drawbacks. Going back, of course, if we look at the principles in warfare itself, combatants are not to be deliberately harmed, but of course the problem today is so many of the combatants non-combatants have lived near the great cities where industrialization and the production of weapon systems are located. So that leaves aggressor nations or nations who are fighting in a war will often bomb those areas where, of course, people are making the armaments for the war, and as a consequence, large amounts of civilians are killed. Proportionality, that only certain means are to be used to restore injured rights, so not all weapons and strategies are permissible. That can get a little hazy at certain times, as we know, because how do you accomplish a particular objective isn't always so clear in the fog of war. So it's something that also we need to look at with a really keen eye. And that certainly sort of discounts nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction. But one of the challenges that has occurred here is new technologies which tend to blur the lines between weapons of mass destruction and what we would call conventional weapons. Some conventional weapons, or even now we have some small nuclear weapons that begin to erode what's known as the nuclear fire break. That is the distinction between conventional and nuclear weapons. If the conventional weapons become so destructive they mirror some elements of, say, nuclear weapons, it reduces the distinction between the two. And some people may resort to nuclear weapons because they don't have the conventional weapons to respond in kind. So you can see how this can get pretty complicated. Just war criteria, many people have argued that maybe it's seen its day and maybe we should move on beyond that, but others have argued that this criteria at least gives us a baseline by which to measure the actions of political leaders and military leaders in terms of human rights and unjust aggression. The other thing is, after the war, the church teaches that there has to be some level of vindication of people's rights, that even the vanquished, now we must make sure that their rights are guaranteed. Second of all, that reconciliation and repair are part of the relationship. So former aggressors are to do all they can to reconcile, and that to repair the relationship that was broken so that it doesn't happen again. And restoration is to help bring the vanquished to a functioning society. So the victor has an obligation to help restore a society back to a functioning society and not simply leave it in desolation. In a sense, in a way, that's not only good moral advice, whereas it's sound practical advice. Nations that have been vanquished, who cannot get help from the outside, over time, this builds deep resentments, and of course, it then leads to future conflicts. The issue of war, of course, does raise the issue, and one of the concerns that the church has said is so many resources go to war and to preparing for war. And so we know that it's a costly business. We know that during the Cold War period, about 50% of all U.S. scientists were more or less committed to defense-related industries and the manufacture or production of, or even the design of new weapon systems. And in the nuclear world, of course, this adds into billions and billions of dollars. President Eisenhower in 1953 pretty much summarized the challenge that was before him and the nation as well. He said that every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies, in the final sense, a theft from those who are hungry and are not fed, from those who are cold and are not clothed. The world in arms is not spending money alone. It is spending the sweat of its laborers, the genius of its scientists, and the hopes of its children. Eisenhower, of course, had run into that particular dilemma as president that he would continue to deal with, which was the military-industrial complex that had developed at the time. Clearly, the military industry and the government itself was deeply concerned about how to maintain security during the Cold War, when the United States and the USSR consistently were involved in a nuclear arms competition that not made the world safer in a sense, but actually made it more dangerous. In fact, during the Eisenhower administration, the United States nuclear stockpile reached its highest number of megatons. Not as many weapons as today, but the destructive force of these weapons, because they weren't as accurate as they are today. The idea was if you use enough force, you can probably get most of the primary targets you're interested in just by sheer force. So the megatonnage has gone down, but the numbers had gone up for a long time, and and of course the accuracy. The whole point of a weapon is to be accurate and to be lethal in its effects. So we struggle today with the fact that this lethality of our weapons and their accuracy with shorter reaction times create greater tension, certainly during a crisis when it may appear that hostilities are imminent. One side may feel tempted to use their weapons rather than to risk losing them. The Catholic Church raised a concern in the Second Vatican Council. The Council, of course, met in 1962, in a year that witnessed the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was the closest countries have come to a real live general nuclear war. And at the time, of course, I was 6 years old, and of course, anybody my age remembers something of this. And it so frightened the bishops that were meeting at the Vatican Council, the Ecumenical Council, that they said that they wanted to look at war, in an entirely new way. Peace is not merely the absence of war, they said, nor can it be reduced solely to the maintenance of a balance of power between enemies, nor is it brought about by dictatorship. Instead, it is rightly and appropriately called an enterprise of justice. Now, this is in Article 78 of the Pastoral Constitution of the Church in the modern world. It is, of course, the longest of the Vatican documents, and it deals specifically with the Church's engagement with the world as a servant church. What can we bring to the world in the midst of the dangers that was facing us in the 1960s and even today? So this whole sense that the church wanted to be very clear about is peace is not merely the absence of military conflict or just reduced to a sort of an armed truce, but it really is basically an enterprise of justice. The idea here is the more just our world is, the less likely conflicts will be generated, and there'll be less incentive because the cost benefits involved in such a war would certainly costs would be astronomical, and no one could see any particular benefit coming from them. And it is attempt, of course, it is one of the steps that is trying to find ways to delegitimize warfare, not only in our world today, but in the future, where developments could, which we cannot necessarily foresee, but which, given the present circumstance, could devolve very quickly into a major war. Dr. King says, well, how do we deal with these specific problems? Obviously, we just can't sit and watch as things continue the way they are. There has to be some kind of action. And he was very concerned that so often people think that evolution or the processes of human evolution will somehow solve problems. And of course, we know that that really has no historical ground to it. Rather, he said that human progress, of course, never rolls in on wheels of inevitability. It comes through the tireless efforts of men and women willing to be co-workers with God. And without this hard work, time itself becomes an ally of the forces of social stagnation. We must use time creatively in the knowledge that the time is always ripe to do right. And that was from King's letter from a Birmingham jail in 1963. You may remember that the SCLC was down in Birmingham trying to desegregate the city at that time. And King himself was receiving criticism that maybe the time wasn't ripe to do this. Maybe we need to wait till people evolve and our society evolves. Well, of course, that was just an excuse for doing nothing, and King saw through that very quickly. He basically raised the issue that we can't rely on time to solve our problems. We have to rely on human beings working together, rethinking things, coming to new levels of awareness to help build a more just society. In the 20th century, of course, new technologies have been introduced that now created millions of casualties. In 1945, in the last 12 months of the Second World War, 1 million people were being killed a month. Astronomical. If we were to use the weapons we have today, 1 million people would be killed every minute. So we can see that the technological jump that occurred at the end of the Second World War and that continues even to today could really threaten life on the planet. Now, this, of course, led some people to the rejection of the just war principles, and it led societies to adopt the whole notion of total war against whole societies. Clearly, the Second World War is exactly how that was fought. Civilians were deliberately targeted with the bombing of cities and industrial plants. The old prohibitions about what we did to people in war were sort of thrown out. So it became the 20th century, which often held itself up as the age of civilization, actually would bear witness to the most barbaric forms of human warfare that has yet been conceived. Certainly, not only were some 50 million people killed during the war, but the attempt to annihilate the entire Jewish people in Europe by the Nazi regime in Germany, certainly, and some of the atrocities that went on in other parts of the war bear witness to the fact that this maybe civilization is somewhat overrated, as someone once said. The atomic age, of course, created the possibility of complete destruction. The United States, by 1961, in its nuclear warfighting plan, estimated that if they had to go to a full-scale general nuclear war, that the United States could inflict 600 million casualties on the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, and China. And of course, the United States would also, of course, have been damaged in all that. In the final year, as we said in World War II, you had this tremendous amount of possible casualties. The church said, of course, that we were to look at war in an entirely new way for human survival. And that's what was really coming out of the Second Vatican Council. In Gaudium et Spes, they said this: the horror and perversity of war is immensely magnified by the addition of scientific weapons, and for acts of war involving these weapons can inflict massive and indiscriminate destruction, thus going far beyond the bounds of legitimate defense. Indeed, if the kind of instruments which can now be found in the armories of the great nations were to be employed to their fullest, An almost total and altogether reciprocal slaughter of each side by the other would follow, not to mention the widespread devastation that would take place in the world and deadly after effects that would be spawned by the use of weapons such as these. All these considerations compel us to undertake an evaluation of war with an entirely new attitude. The men of our time must realize that they will have to give a somber reckoning of their deeds of war, for the course of the future will depend greatly on the decisions they make today. So I think this is really essential when we begin to look at um, how the church is making decisions about war and peace today. They are looking at in the context that things have changed so radically in terms of technology that often we are struggling just trying to keep up to these new changes. And as we noted very earlier in the course, there are all kinds of new things being introduced into our time. Cyber war has become a major concern for all the powers. And we know that already cyber attacks have been launched against the United States. And of course, the United States has also launched some cyber actions against Iran and other parties as well. Where this goes in a nuclear world, cyber attacks on someone's nuclear forces could result in, accidental launch or, deliberate sabotage of one's particular capabilities, especially in a time of a crisis, would clearly be interpreted as an act of war. We also now know anti-satellite capabilities are becoming one of the technological innovations that began in the 1980s, but today is becoming very, very capable. We see that the Soviet Union has launched satellites that can follow other satellites, that can actually grab other satellites in space, and sort of change their own trajectory. So it's becoming the sense that space is the new frontier for military conflict is becoming all too evident. When you begin to combine all these factors with climate change and the crises that can be spawned by that, we realize that we're entering into a 21st century which really needs committed people to be peacemakers. There were only two condemnations at the Second Vatican Council, which was rather unusual for a church council. Usually there's whole lists of condemnations that are part of any particular ecumenical council, but here there are only two. The first one is this one: any act of war aimed indiscriminately at the destruction of entire cities or extensive areas along with their population is a crime against God and man himself. It merits unequivocal and unhesitating condemnation. Now, that was one condemnation. The other was against abortion and infanticide. So those are the only two things that merited a condemnation by the Council Fathers, clearly recognizing just how close we'd come in the Cuban Missile Crisis, understanding that the devastation that would occur would basically end human civilization and most likely end human life on the planet. Clearly, this is a direct confrontation and refutation of the God of life and love. So it was clear that human beings, of course, simply cannot have the arrogance to believe that they have the moral right to do such a thing. In 1983, the U.S. Catholic bishops went forward with a pastoral letter called the Challenge of Peace. This was done in the context of what appeared to be that the Soviet Union and the United States were growing ever closer to nuclear war. There were a number of developments that was prompting this. One, the United States in 1979, I think we stated in the previous lecture, had gone ahead with Presidential Directive number 59, which basically called for the United States to prepare their weapon systems and strategies to fight limited, protracted, and global nuclear wars and prevail. Obviously, a very difficult objective, and so it led to the decision to begin to manufacture and deploy highly accurate and destructive weapon systems that could carry out the plan. Of course, the Soviet Union was doing the same thing. From 1980 to 1983, the relations between the United States and the Soviet Union became extremely chilly, probably the coldest time in the Cold War in some time. And in 1983, there was a real danger of nuclear war. It is clear that when we looked at the last session, that false alarms almost triggered a nuclear war. Now, what the bishops basically came to in the letter was this. They said that faith calls us to act in times of danger with courage. And that's something I think that's required of anyone who would be a peacemaker. I mean, um, what goes into it means a fundamental willingness to often step outside of the normal ways of looking at things, and certainly to step out of the need of other people's approval. The bishops provisionally accepted deterrence while reducing nuclear arms. That is, deterrence itself is immoral. To threaten to do evil is evil. That's just a fundamental to moral theology. But provisional acceptance meant they were willing to go along with the existence of deterrence so long as there was a consistent commitment to the reduction of nuclear arms. And really, since that time, that has exactly been the case. We went from about 70,000 weapons in the early 80s. We are down to about 13,000. So significant arms reductions have taken place, but still the dangers remain. They agree on moral principles. They said the bishops were very clear. There are certain Catholic moral principles that we maintain in this letter, but we may disagree on how to get things done. So believers agree on the same principles. How they accomplish the goal can be an area for discussion. Okay? There can be no use of nuclear weapons without the risk of escalation of global war. The bishops were very, very reluctant to say that any use at all would have some kind of, would be morally appropriate. They just say the risk of escalation is so great that they could not conceive of any particular situation where that these use of these weapons would be morally appropriate. And of course, they call for an end to the arms race and to rethink our world, to think of the ways we deal with our disputes without resorting to war. And that pretty much wraps up this particular presentation. It was just to give an overview to the Church's vision of war and peace, and to look at some of the challenges in that. If you may be able to use this to help fill out some of the answers that you will be doing for the questions that will be submitted for assignments. In the meantime, take care. If you have any questions, feel free to send me an email. Thank you.